back, everybody, to another Tangent TV webinar. My name is Joseph Lanzalata. I am the Student Entrepreneurship Program Manager for Tangent, Trinity's Ideas Workspace. Today, we are lucky enough to have with us an entrepreneur and sales professional for the last 30 years, an international speaker and speakers coach with over 20 years experience in the area of business coaching and personal development, and the founder of Aristo.ie, the one and only Andrew Keogh. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Amazing. Well, we're so happy to have you. For everyone who's with us live today in the webinar, feel free to pop any questions you have in the Q&A section down below. At the end, I'll ask any questions that we have lingering for Andrew beyond the interview. And then for anybody who's watching this as a rebroadcast on the Tangent TV YouTube channel, be sure to subscribe and follow us on the Tangent social media channels at TCD Tangent, so you can join us live for the next webinar and ask questions to amazing people like Andrew, who we have here today. So with that promotion out of the way, Andrew, I'm so grateful to have you here today. The goal of today, we're talking about shaping the perfect pitch. And I'm glad we have you because you're someone who has helped a lot of people with preparing their pitches and these sorts of things. But often when you have that area of expertise, there's a story before the story. And I'd like to maybe to introduce yourself to the people who are here. Could you share with us a bit of your kind of background and how you came to be the pitching, presenting, storytelling expert you are today?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's like everybody when you ask them what's their background and how they end up in their career. The majority of people say by accident. And in some ways it was the same with me. I had a career in engineering and in engineering sales in particular. And I often say to people that no one's paid me any money. No one's paid me a salary since 1988 other than me. So that qualifies me as an entrepreneur. And I had an engineering distribution business for 20 years, and we closed that in 2008 with lots of other people with the crash and the downturn in 2008. And then I had the thoughts of what should I do? And then I decided, well, why don't I turn what was my hobby up to then into my business? I had been involved in Toastmasters. I had been what they call an avocational coach for the Dale Carnegie organization for 10 or 15 years. It was the stuff I loved, coaching people, helping people to present better. So as a result of that, I decided to form Aristo and start doing that. That very quickly became the niche of pitching insofar as I did work. I met originally, probably some of you will know him. I met Ronna Mink, and Ronna Mink asked me to do some work for DCU Invent at the time. Then I ended up doing probably work for most of the universities around the country at some stage. You know, they're now regularly working with Trinity, as you well know. And so that was, and I suppose it's one of the things I'm regularly advising startups is that it's really important, if you can, to find your niche. The thing you don't want to be doing is trying to be a little bit good at everything. It's much better to sort of specialize and know exactly, you know, have a particular area that you're strong in and that you have confidence in. And so that's how it sort of turned out. Then I sort of, like everything in Ireland, I suppose, well, it's the same. What you're trying to think of is you're inclined to think of the world being a big place. But in reality, if you found your niche, then you get known in the UK and you get known in America. And for example, tomorrow, I have a guy getting up at 7 o'clock in the morning in San Francisco. And thankfully, it's me coaching him at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But how did he find me? Thankfully, he was recommended by a colleague. And so I'm now doing, well, I regularly do work in America, but that's a sort of an example of once you found your niche, then you found a bigger community that recommends you and sort of refer you on. And that's what makes it interesting. And it's probably, as I said earlier, it's probably the message that you need to sort of, when I'm talking to startups, it's don't tell me you're going to do business with everyone. Tell me the particular niche you're going after. And when you've cracked that one, then you can go after another one. But you need to be clear about who you're going to do business with and who you're going to send an invoice to.
Amazing. And I know the invoice thing, we're going to get to it a little bit. That's such an interesting concept about who you're going to end up with, but it's great, like, for me to hear. So you found your niche. Your niche is in the pitching and presenting. Now, I'm sure you can advise on far more than that. When you speak to people, there's a wealth of knowledge that comes to the conversation. And in that context, before we even get into kind of the specific tactics of like how to build the perfect pitch, I'd be interested in your take on how you approach pitching and presenting in terms of the kind of theory behind crafting the perfect pitch. Like, how do we even start to think about pitching and presenting?
Okay, well, I think if we use the two words, pitching and presenting, what I often describe is that if I had my way, I would ban the word pitch. I would ban the word presentation. I regularly say to people, the reason churches are empty is no one wants to be sermonized to anymore. And if you're thinking about sort of imparting your knowledge and things like that, well, then you're as likely to sort of bore people as anything else. So I think the real thing is to sort of think about whatever engagement or communication is, you have to think of it as being a conversation. You need to believe the person who's listening to you, whether it's an audience of 550 or 500, they need to believe that they're in conversation with you, that you're having a conversation with them, and they should feel that they could interrupt you at any time and ask a question and chat away to you, and you'd be perfectly comfortable doing that, as opposed to, I have my prepared script and I'm going to launch into it, and if anything happens, like the slide doesn't work or whatever it is, I'm dead. That's not how it should be. It should be that you're, and also that's applicable from the point of view of a business person, because what you're needing to demonstrate is I'm flexible, I can deal with a stressful situation, I can engage with people, I can talk to people who are perhaps more senior than me, more successful than me, wealthier than me, but I still know what I'm doing and I'm capable of having a conversation, engaging with those sorts of people. So it's always about the first place we're looking to start is, how do we create that conversation? And invariably that then turns around to, okay, so what's the first story we're going to tell?
And that's how you get into the kind of storytelling element. And I love what you said with the idea of it is a conversation. It's always a conversation. I think that's a big impetus behind why, when we went with the kind of tangent TV format, even here, we could have people come on and give these long presentations with slides and these sorts of things. And we even discussed it just before. The idea of having slides could make it feel too presentation-y. And we really don't want that. We just want people to be a part of the conversation and learn and understand what it is that someone who is an expert in presenting, or sorry, I won't use any of the dirty words anymore, how you think about these sorts of things. And I find that super interesting myself as someone who's interested in presenting in these sorts of things. And I hope that our audience so far is. And guys, yeah, you are welcome to interrupt us. If you have questions, pop them in the chat, those sorts of things. This is open. When you talk about a conversation, though, there's always going to be some line of thinking within a conversation. So I'm speaking to you, there's a general aura or topic within which I'm speaking to you, and I may have sort of things I'm trying to convey to you, like, okay, here's a specific topic I'm interested in, or a key message I'm hoping to get across to you to help you understand or to gain knowledge reciprocally. Is there a way that you go about kind of figuring out in a presentation or in just general those key messages that you might be trying to convey? How do you start to identify those?
Yeah, and I think that's very true. And you have the situation, and we all know people who could talk non-stop, but they never come to a conclusion, and it sort of drifts off in all sorts of directions. So that's a conversation, but it's not a terribly interesting conversation. What I'm looking to craft with people is an interesting conversation that's clearly that you know where you're going on the journey, and that you're not just talking for the sake of talking. You're talking because there's a purpose and a direction and a destination you want to end up in, and that's what makes it interesting then for both the speaker and the audience. The best way of describing it is that at the end of whoever you're talking to, at the end of that conversation, they need to see or feel in some way that they're better as a result of having listened to you. if they're not better as a result of having listened to you, if you take your business idea and they don't see how your business idea can be beneficial to them, well then they've just wasted 15 or 20 minutes of their time. You can think about the number of movies you've went to watch over the years where you've sat in the cinema for an hour and a half and it's been okay until there's a terrible ending. And then you just feel like you've wasted your whole hour and a half because the ending was desperate. And I could probably use stronger language, but I'm aware I'm on Tangent TV. And then what happens is you leave the cinema and you know you're disappointed and hasn't worked well for you and you're unhappy. And so it has to be great movies, great books, great stories, always have an uplifting end to them. And that's what in exactly the same with a pitch, it's the same.
And that's when you talk about kind of the difference between a conversation being broad and just kind of a conversation about anything that's not purpose-driven. If you have that aim in mind, it's a lot easier to craft the conversation. Yeah. So when you start crafting kind of the pitch, and in just a second, we'll get into kind of maybe the more tactical things about how you actually go about that, is one of the first things you start to look at the end goal of the pitch and then kind of work backwards from there? Is that the process?
Yeah, probably. When I start to work with someone, the first conversation the first story I want to create is what's the problem that they solve? But then if you think about that, they have to be solving that problem for somebody. And then as soon as you identify that somebody, you say, okay, so when you've solved that problem, how is that somebody better?
Right.
So very quickly, you're thinking about the better. Why I always start with the problem is it gives me an understanding of who I'm going to work with, who I'm going to talk to. And that clearly is then helpful. And the big mistake that everybody makes, and it doesn't need to be startups, it's every business person. The question we're often asked is, what do you do? And the last thing you want to answer is what you do, because what you do is deadly boring. You know, I have an app, I have a platform, I have a this, I have a that, I have the other. Do I care? No. I only care if at the end of it, I discover that this is hugely important either to me or to my business or to someone who I care about or someone who I love. If I, if I go home and say to my wife, I heard an amazing story today, really a business opportunity. I meet my son who's in business and I say, let me tell you about this fantastic app I was listening to that. Now, then you're a success. If I'm trying to explain your technology, you're not a success because I'm not going to explain your technology terribly well. So it is about, first and foremost, the problem, and then it's about how are you going to, and let me give you an example, is probably the easiest way of doing that. About 5 or 6 months ago, I was speaking to a researcher in the medical space. And this wasn't my opening, this was his opening. What I did was I gave him the courage to tell this story because it requires confidence, because what he was going to do was quite brave, particularly for a researcher who's been in a lab for like sort of 5 or 6 years sort of working away. And what he said was, if you go back to Greek times 3,000 years ago and you got a brain ailment, brain cancer, brain tumor, whatever they called it back then, the diagnosis was that you had 9 to 12 months to live. And then he said, so Senator John McCain in 2018 got brain cancer. And the diagnosis for him was 9 to 12 months. And then he asked the question, so does that demonstrate that in the last 3,000 years, we've learned nothing about brain cancer? Because the diagnosis is exactly the same. Now, does he have your attention? Yes, he does. Do you know someone who might have cancer, or do you know someone who might have brain cancer? Are you now interested? Yes, of course you are. And then he just goes on to say, so let me tell you how we're going to change that. Now I want to know, If he'd have started
Absolutely.
the research and all that sort of stuff, I probably would have drifted off, and most of the audience would, because it's not their area of expertise. But everybody knows someone who's had some form of cancer, and everybody's wanting to sit up and pay attention. And how could this man have perhaps sort of helped John McCain to live a longer, more fruitful life if he, you know, if his research had been earlier or whatever that is. So that's what you're always looking to do. As soon as people sit up and pay attention, clearly later on in the conversation, they'll want to know how you do it, and they'll want you to prove that you can do it. But first and foremost, you must get their attention to say, you should listen to this, guys. This is really important for you or someone who you care about.
It's amazing, because that's the kind of like the opening, the hook to get people interested. If you're going fishing, you catch something, then you can bring them down the way. In terms of that opening hook, I've heard you refer to it as the opening story, right?
Yeah.
And that's an interesting like phrasing of it in my view, because it's the idea of like, you think you're starting your pitch, you may say an elevator pitch, or you're starting with the opening thing, with the idea and the concept of thinking about it as an opening story. I find particularly interesting. I know it ties for you into the broader, you have a template, the kind of process. And if we maybe get into a bit more, the kind of like the structure of that template and that process, and how does that kind of opening story fit into the broader context?
Okay, well, very simply, the way I would describe it, at its very simplest, the pitch should say, first and foremost, it says, as a presenter, it says, I'm going to say or do something in the first 20 words or 7 seconds that switches you off from whatever you were thinking about to think about me. Oh, well, that's really interesting, isn't that? Well, that's fascinating. And that's what newspapers do. I've several humorous newspaper headlines, one of them which I particularly love. It was the New York Times, and it said, headless body found in topless bar. Now, would you want to read the newspaper? Or the other one, which was the Financial Times, which said, ice cream man had assets frozen. Now, immediately they have your attention. Now you want to read the article, and that's what a pitch should do as well. Because if you think about it, whoever you're pitching to has probably heard 20 pitches that day. So how is yours going to stand out? How is yours going to be memorable? So there's that. And then ideally that headline should flow into the problem story. The story then should be, and I would be saying, the story probably, I'm coaching people, I'm saying, the story is probably a minute and a half. If most people now, if it's a pitch competition, probably get somewhere like 5 to 7 minutes or something like that. So I would be allowing people now a sort of a minute and a half to tell the story, because if I'm engaged by the story, then I'll listen to the rest. So the process would be, get my attention, tell me a story that represents a problem that I'm likely to have, or someone who I know is likely to have. Then you can introduce yourself. Then you can talk very briefly about what it is that you do. It's an app, it's a platform, it's a 5 years of medical research, whatever that is. You can tell me a little bit about that. And then at its simplest, once you've told me what you do, the presentation, and I use the word presentation and pitch because it's the language that other people use. But so then coming at the end of the presentation must finish up by you saying, so as a result of what we've done and what we're doing, let me remind you how you're better. If our research had been earlier, perhaps John McCain would still be alive today. That's the message you want to. That's the message you want to be delivering. And
So you almost
very simplest. Now, there's other things that are required in the pitch, but if you answered those 3 or 4 points that I'm making, and you didn't talk about your sales projections, or you didn't talk about your competition, I'll come and talk to you. I'll want to know, and I'll come and ask you, and whoever it is will come and ask you. But if you didn't get their attention, they don't care whether you talked about your competition or the size of your market, because they stopped listening.
Absolutely. And I like the idea. It's almost like you sandwich your presentation in a way, or you sandwich your pitch in the sense that it's like, there's that high level thing that I'm going to like get everybody's attention with. And then you reiterate that at the end to reflect on the emotion that they had in the beginning. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. I love that as a concept because it's also I've seen it where people try to fit everything into one presentation, or I've created a 10-page business plan and now I need to turn that 10-page business plan somehow and say it all in 5 minutes. The aim, I guess, is not necessarily to take that 10-page business plan and say it in 5 minutes. If you were in a way being kind of reductive from that 10-page business plan to the presentation, what would be kind of the key points you look for to like go, okay, from that bit, I'll put this here, from that bit, I'll put this here. What makes it into the presentation?
Okay, there's two ways of looking at this, and your analogy is very good because you've got a business plan. And if you use the analogy of it being going to the movies and using the movies, what gets you to go to buy the ticket to go see the movie is the trailer. And the trailer has all the exciting bits, all the interesting bits. It doesn't reveal the plot. It doesn't tell you about anything else. It just says, wow, I have to go and see this movie. And that's what the pitch is. So the pitch is none of the boring bits. The pitch is, I have to go and see this movie. I have to find out more about this. So the key elements to it are, the problem story is the most important. If I don't get the problem story, I stop listening. So it doesn't matter what comes next because I switched off. I'm thinking about what's for dinner tonight or whatever that is. So it's the problem story. And then the next question is, who do you solve that problem for? Because that's your customer. So I need to know, these are the people I'm going to solve this problem for. It's people who are likely to have brain cancer. It's people who are likely to whatever. And then the other thing I want to know early on is, who are you and who is your team? Because the thing that's critical you need to realize is that investors, if we're talking about investors invest in the people. They don't invest in the idea. They want to know, is this someone who will work hard? Is this someone who's capable of leading a team? Is this someone, when the going gets really tough, that they'll keep going? And that's the judgment they're making more than other. Like, there's lots of really good ideas and lots of ideas out there, but there's not lots of really good people who can bring these ideas to fruition. And that's what they're looking for more than anything else. So it's, tell me the problem, tell me the market or who you're going to sell it to, and tell me who's the team. If you answer those three questions, they'll beat a path to your door and ask you the other information. But clearly there is other information, but they're the three key elements. That's the things I must know.
Okay. And I love that kind of starts the conversation, because it is going to be a long, you'd project that in the best case scenario, it's going to be a longer conversation than just the one way or maybe two way if there's a Q&A that happens on the stage. In an ideal world, you meet with that person afterwards and there's a follow-up in the same way that you may have with an elevator pitch. The elevator pitch is just a clickbait. It's just to get somebody to have the next conversation. Even on a stage, it's still not to say everything. It's still just to get that follow-on conversation, exactly. Would you say?
There's always an ask at the end of everything, and you have to be clear about what you're at. And I describe the elevator pitch in a sort of, I'd like to think in a humorous way. The elevator pitch is, in American terms, is you're at a conference, you're trying to meet someone, you can't meet them, but you get back to your hotel, and just as you arrive at the elevator door, that person is standing waiting to get into the elevator. And you both get in together, and now you have an opportunity while you're in the elevator to launch into your pitch. Most pitches I hear, by floor 3, the person would have pressed the panic button and ran screaming from the lift. What you want to be is the person that gets to floor 47 and the doors open and the person says, here's my business card, ring my PA and we'll make an appointment for next Tuesday, or let me meet you for dinner down in the bar later on, or whatever. Now, that's being a success. They ain't going to write a check for you in the lift. So the success in each time you meet someone is, so what would be success for me today? Success for me today will be get a meeting. Success for me today would be to have a beer later on or after the conference or whatever. That would be success. Then you think about, after that success, what would be the next success? But
and then
it isn't to give them the whole 9 yards and the 30-page business plan. That's not what it is. Yeah.
You make sure that you have those incremental successes to kind of follow on. And then in that way, I mean, it's as in the same way that you wouldn't want it to just feel like a pitch, you want it to feel like a story that you're telling. It's a conversation, but it's also relationship building, because you're building a relationship with the people. And I know that kind of brings me into, I know that you've touched on it in many ways here, but just to get kind of one clear sort of concise element of it, there are 3 tips that you had mentioned the other day to me that are like your top 3 tips on where do you start, right? When I'm starting to create a pitch, we're taking maybe a step back here, but just when I'm starting to create a pitch, the 3 steps or the 3 tips that you would give to somebody to get them started, what would they be?
Well, I suppose, and more so than tips, they're questions. The first question I would say to whoever I'm sitting down with is, who do we want to hear this story? Who's the person you want to hear this story? And if they say everybody, that's never going to work. So even if I'm saying, if you're going to speak at a conference or an event or a startup event, and there's going to be 50 people there, of that 50 people, who's the very one person you would want to talk to? And we'll create the talk for that one person. And the thing that's fascinating about it, if that one person gets your message, so will 10 others. But if you try and make a talk that's applicable to 50 people, none of them get it. It's just a mishmash of, it doesn't mean anything. So it's almost the first thing we do is, so who do you want to hear the story? Write down a name. Tell me that person. Tell me a little bit about them. What do you know about them? And the number of times they write down a name and I said, so what do you know about them? But they don't know anything. Where, when I started in sales 30 years ago, it was difficult to know about people. Now you have LinkedIn, now you have Facebook, now you have websites. Now you can know an awful lot about a person before you've ever met them. And so that's the first one. Who do you want to hear this story? The next question is so what are we going to say that's going to interest that? What are we going to say that's going to interest that person? It's going to hold that person's interest. And that's the problem story. Mm-hmm. And then the final element of that is how we, at the end of this engagement of talking to this person, how does this person see themselves as being better? And I want to be clear about this, because sometimes it causes confusion. When I talk about better, what people are inclined to do is they're inclined to talk about their product and how that's better. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the person who buys the product. How are they better? Okay. How is their life improved as a result of what you're doing? And I'll give you an interesting, I'm working with a lady at the moment who has amazing technology that I can't explain. But how she opens a talk is she says, when I'm preparing food for my children, I'm always concerned. And I'm really concerned now, because a lot of the food that is being produced in the world is full of heavy metals. It's full of arsenic, it's full of cadmium, it's full of lead. In some cases, in parts of California, the greens that they're producing are 20 times higher than what would be allowed in terms of European regulation. In China, rice is contaminated, and they are doing amazing work in China now about reducing heavy metals in food. But that's how she starts off, and then she tells that story because that is her concern. That's where she started with, and then she said so. She finishes by saying, she finished the opening introduction by saying, so what I've developed is a process that reduces heavy metals in food for my children, but also for your children. And that's the message, because now it's, I thought by giving my kids greens, I was giving them a good diet. Now they're realizing that maybe it's not all that good. And that's what you're looking to do. And if people buy into that, oh, so what do we need to do? I didn't even know about that. And interestingly, when I tell her a story to various other people, the number of people say, I never knew that. No one ever told me that. No one ever told me there was arsenic in the food that we have.
Yeah, until the other day when you mentioned it, I had no idea. It's actually, I'm sure there's a lot of people here who are going to go home and search how much arsenic is in their food these days, and that's the hook then. Yeah.
What's happening now in Europe in particular is if there is a high percentage, they're being told to put it on the label, so people will be aware of it. And so then the finish of that conversation is the product is now introduced, it's now being used, it's now being effective. They're dramatically reducing somewhere between 30 and 50% of heavy metal content in the food. So what we're all getting as a result of what she has done is healthier food.
That's powerful. And I'm excited to have that healthier food as it comes down the pipeline. We're always looking for healthier things. I might take a turn for some of the audience here that might not necessarily think of themselves as kind of that pitch person, right? So there's always the person on the team who more naturally falls into it. It may be yourself, it may be myself, who's like the natural, I'm going to do a pitch or a presentation. But inevitably, I think there always comes a time where somebody has to do a pitch or a presentation and they don't think of themselves as that person. What would be your advice for somebody who is that or sees themselves as that type of person to get introduced to it, or how they might get started?
Okay. Well, again, it's if you think about it, it's go back to that conversation. If you think of it as a conversation, if someone asked you over a cup of coffee to explain your business idea, you could probably do that. If someone asked you over a pint of Guinness, you could probably even do it a little bit more lucidly. And the other key message I would say in regard to that is that if you're wanting to be in business today, and if you have envisaged of being in business today, the key skill is communications. Your technical ability gets you the job. Your ability to communicate gets you promotion. And in lots of ways, you'd like to think, oh, that's not me and I can duck out of that. You can't. That's the simple reality. But you don't have to be the most polished speaker. That's not the requirement. The requirement is to be believable. At the end of every presentation, the judgment everybody makes, they won't admit it to you, but the judgment everybody makes is, do I believe this person? And if they believe you, you'll be a success. You don't need to be the most polished presenter. You don't need to be the most sophisticated. You just need to be believable. And the analogy I would give you for that is, think of the number of very polished presenters you see on television in these days, and would you believe any of them?
Yeah, I could count on one hand.
So that's what we're looking to do. So in some ways, it's very simple skills. It's what, what our parents would have taught us about. It was about, to be honest, to be trustworthy, to be believable, to be true to yourself. But you can't duck out on this. You can't say somebody else will do this. Like, if it's your business idea, I want to hear from you. I don't want to hear from your sales director. I don't want to hear from someone who's a good presenter. I want to talk to you because you're the person who came up with this idea. Where did you get this idea? Why were you passionate about this? Tell me that's what you're looking to do.
And so that can be put into practice in as simple of a way as maybe just speaking to people in general and just improving communication skills, or any sort of tactics around that in terms of what I could do day to day to improve that.
The tip I give everyone is don't tell someone if you're going to do a presentation, if you're going to sort of don't tell them, because if you say, I'm going to do a presentation, I'm going to say this, that, and the other, naturally what everyone does is tells you what's wrong. It's just how we're hardwired. The example I would give is, if you think about it, if you look in the mirror, do you look in the mirror and say, oh, look great today? No, you don't. You look in the mirror and say, this tie doesn't go with this shirt, this jacket doesn't go with this tie, I should have got my hair cut, or whatever that was. You see what's wrong, you don't see what's right. And what I'm looking for you to do is find the opportunity to practice. So if you have a problem story that you think would describe what you do, tell it to people over a cup of coffee, but don't tell them it's a speech we're working on. Just tell them. Tell somebody else, tell somebody else, tell somebody else. And if you've told it 4 or 5 times, it'll be honed into a nice little story, sort of conversation that then becomes part of the pitch. Years ago, I was coaching a lady in DCU, and I had told this story to them, all the people I was coaching, quite senior people in DCU. I was telling, look, don't go home and get your wife or your partner to sort of do this. Go off somewhere quiet and rehearse the talk on your own, and then come back in next week. And Maria came in next week and she said, I found the ideal audience for my speech. I said, who is that? I'm delighted to know, who is it? And she said, we got a little puppy dog. And she said, the puppy dog sits at the kitchen floor. I do the speech and dog wags its tail.
That's amazing. I'm sure it's a captive audience and always a positive feedback.
Yeah, but you know, Dale Carnegie used to say years ago, how does a dog let you know he's happy to see you? He wags his tail. We smile, dogs wag their tail. And she said the dog just sits there and wags his tail as she chats away to him. But what she's doing is she's practicing the speech. She's hearing it out loud. Like I would regularly say to people, any audience that I'm coaching how to speak, the last thing you want to do is be hearing this speech out loud for the first time when you're standing in front of a real audience. That's not what you want to do. But on the other hand, you don't want to be practicing in front of a mirror, because I think if you're practicing in front of a mirror, you start doing things like, I was thinking yesterday, and would not be, you know, and you think you're a Shakespearean actor. That's not.
You get into your own head a bit, then it's
exactly.
Yeah.
It's to be. The best way I can describe it is to be the best possible you that you can be, but it has to be you. It's not a poor imitation of somebody else. It's the best possible you that you can be.
I love that. And that's like, you can tell the story to a load of people. And also I'm sure anybody who's heard me pitch anything about the bees before will be happy to know that I'm not going to stop coming back to them and tell them I'm going to pitch them. So we'll go to more coffee shops or virtual coffee shops these days. Yeah, so I love that. I'm just curious. I had one question kind of from the other side of it, right? So you've been someone who's heard a lot of pitches, a lot of presentations, a lot of stories. As someone who might be listening to somebody share their story, whether they tell you or not that it's a pitch, what is, if I don't know what to say when somebody's shared that with me, if it's like, that sounded okay, that sounded good, how do you give feedback if you're not entirely sure? If I'm not an expert in presenting, how might someone help somebody who's working on a presentation without overstating what they know? Okay.
I'm publishing an article tomorrow on my newsletter and on my website, and it's entitled The 3 Fundamental Principles of Leadership. I think that's what I called it, but something in that sort of order anyhow. And when I was working with the Dale Carnegie organization, their requirement was that you could only give positive feedback. You could not criticize someone. You could only say what was good. And my screen is going to go dead for a moment because it says, I forgot about this, but it says it's about to power off in a minute, so I just need to switch it off and switch it back on. But I continue to talk anyhow. But so their requirement was that you could only give positive feedback. You must say something that's positive. And interestingly, what we found over the years and what they found over the years is if you emphasize the positive, the negative stuff went away. And you didn't even have to draw attention to it. It just went away. People got more confident. And invariably, people are doing things awkwardly or speaking too quickly or not making eye contact or whatever that is. Invariably, they're doing that just because they're under stress and they're not comfortable. So my job is to put people at their ease. And then clearly there are ways you say, well, I suppose what I would do with most people, like I don't create anybody's pitch. What I do is I take their pitch and in most cases move it around. That's what I do in most cases. Regularly, I'd be saying, far better if we told that before we said that. If you were to say this before you said this, this makes this much more understandable and interesting. And that's what I'm doing, because if you think about it, you know, tomorrow with a guy from San Francisco, I have even no idea what his product is at this stage, and I'm going to give him advice. The lady, you know, who's taking heavy metals out of our diet, I don't understand what she does. She's way above my pay grade in terms of technique, but I can still tell her how to make the story more interesting and more engaging. I deal with people who make spray bars for backer tractors. I deal with companies who save energy for big multinational companies, save 20–30% of their energy bills. Do I know how to save energy? No, I don't. They do, but I know how to get them to tell the story better. And that's my particular skill.
I love that. And it's to emphasize the positive, because I think no matter what somebody's hearing, whether they're an expert in that or not, you can always find something that's positive and say something good about what you've heard. And even that sharing it, I love that you have seen that to prove true, that if you share the positive, the negative kind of will fade away.
It will fade away. My guarantee, if I'm speaking to a group, if I'm coaching a group of people, my guarantee at the beginning of the morning is, I said, you know, you're going to present twice, 3 times during the course of the day. So we're going to hear maybe 30 presentations. But my guarantee to you is I will never tell you what you've done wrong. I will only tell you what you've done right. But at the end of the day, everyone will be better.
That's awesome. I see we've already gotten one question coming through. I'm just going to mention to anybody who's in the webinar right now to put your questions in. I am going to ask as many as I can at the end here. So put them either into the Q&A section or into the chat. I'll see them there too. But Andrew, before I let you go over to their questions, I have just 1 or 2 more for you. The one is for somebody who might be listening to this and doesn't necessarily have something to present, right? So when you have a business or you have a startup or you have something you want to pitch or present, that's good. We can run with these skills. But for somebody who's like, I know I might one day have something I need to pitch or present, but I want to try and practice this in the meantime, what would you recommend they do now to maybe prepare themselves for when the time comes?
Well, there's 2 elements, 2 answers to that. The first one is we're always presenting. You'll be going to interviews, you'll be getting interviewed for jobs. And again, the best presenter will get the job. The best conversationist will get the job. Again, they may be looking for academic qualifications, but your academic qualifications are no good unless you can impart that information to other people and work with other people. So they'll be looking for that. They'll be looking for that sort of conversational skill for the rest of your life. And again, whether you ever start a business or not, or go work for a business, what gets you promotion is your conversational skills, your communication skills. That's the requirement. And there was another element to that. I joined an organization called Toastmasters years ago. I've been in Toastmasters since about 1980. It's very inexpensive and it's a terrific organization. You know, it'll cost you 100 quid a year or something like that, but you will get multiples of that back in terms of your ability to just be a good communicator. And so I highly recommend that.
Okay, amazing. It's great to have kind of a good place to start or a place to go. And that is kind of, in terms of where people might go next, that is my kind of like last question for you. I may have 1 or 2 others later, but my last question for you is like, if people want to learn more or hear from you more, you said you have a blog post coming out tomorrow. Where can people go and kind of see more and learn more? I know you have a lot of articles and things.
The easiest place is to go to the website, which is Aristo.ie. And on that, in the articles, there's now over 80 articles, all to do with presenting, communication, better communication skills, storytelling, pitching. They're all in there together. I write one once a fortnight, and invariably I write them based on what's happened to me in the last week or 2. So they're all very relevant, and they're all sort of, the one tomorrow in actual fact is about the 3 fundamental principles that Carnegie would talk about in terms of dealing with people, which are, his 3 fundamental principles are: never criticize, condemn, or complain, which is we talked about already. Always give honest and sincere appreciation. And the third one is arouse in the other person an eager want. Because if you're a leader or a manager and the other person doesn't want to do it, they're not. And that reflects on you. So you've got to create an environment where people want to do what you want them to do. And that's what good leadership and management is about. So that's what the article is about tomorrow.
That's awesome. Like I'll definitely be reading it myself. For anybody who's in the webinar right now, I did actually just put the link to Andrew's blog there. Anybody watching on Tangent TV, you can just check the description. I'll have the link there to Andrew's blog there. So you can go ahead and read it at that point. I'm sure the article will be out. So I'm excited for that. If you're okay, Andrew, I might ask you just one or two questions from kind of the audience members here. So if anybody has any as I'm reading this, please do pop them either in the chat or the questions. But the one we have here is, how do you eliminate nerves? Is it simply practice and more practice, or is there something else?
It is practice and more practice. And the same, it's the practice over the cup of coffee. It's the practice where you don't pretend to be practicing, but you are practicing. But primarily it's being yourself. And it's not about, and this is a rule, never memorize what you're going to say, because that makes you more nervous, because what you're doing is you're trying to remember something. And then if it doesn't come out, or you miss a sentence or you miss a paragraph, then you sort of, you've doubly made yourself nervous. So don't do that. Be yourself, be conversational, and practice. But practice isn't that sort of thing of rehearsing it. I've talked now quite a lot to actors, well-known actors, and actors don't even memorize scripts anymore now. What they do is they have a rough outline of the script, but they don't remember it word for word. They turn up and they play the role and the character, and they sort of adopt it to some extent to suit their particular style, and that's, so it's, even they don't remember word for word anymore.
Okay, that's really powerful, because I've spoken to a number of people who it's like, when I'm practicing, I need to memorize this, right? And it's not necessarily the idea of memorizing. I've said before, even just practicing messing up and finishing, because it's like, if you have your script, sure, you're going to write something down, you practice it. If you mess up, make sure you finish, because people would have the tendency to like, oh, I got to try it again until I get it right. But that means you've ended up with maybe 30 times that you didn't finish, and then only one time where you actually practiced your finishing line, which is the last thing people remember. So the idea of like, don't practice to be perfect, practice to be ready, that resonates massively. I love that.
Actually, I think I'll use that line. Thank you.
No worries. We'll see. This is, reverse mentoring happens sometimes. This is why we have a conversation, right? So another question, if that's okay. So do you ever use props in case you forget anything? I think props or prompts in case you forget something.
Props are great. I always use props. I always have props. And the other thing I regularly have, it's not that you don't turn up without notes. What you do is you turn up, the way I describe it, you turn up on the back of an envelope with 5 or 6 keywords. So you can glance the keywords, and the keywords guide you through the conversation. So if it sort of says something like airplane, so you look at airplane and it reminds you to tell the airplane story. And then there's a sort of euro symbol which says, I need to talk to them about money. And then there's a sort of a question mark symbol that reminds you something. The other thing I do, and it's back from my sort of Dale Carnegie days, and lots of speakers do, is where you build a stack of silly objects in your head. And the more ridiculous the objects are, the more likely you are to remember them. So you have 6 or 7 objects in your head, and then you just go through I did that, I talked about that, I talked about that, I talked about that. And the beauty of that is that if you are running out of time, then you can skip a couple of objects and go much the same way as you were saying, go to the last object and talk about the last object. And they're very good ways also they're very good ways if you're practicing, particularly if you're sort of driving a car or something. Well, then you can have that stack in your head, or you can have that envelope on the seat beside you, and you can just chat away to yourself as you drive along in the car. And what happens is, the more you do that, the more it starts to flow, and the more comfortable you get with it, and the more easy it is then for you to deliver the talk.
That's awesome. I know there's a lot of value there, a lot to take in. If people have more questions, by all means, please do pop them in. But I think that's kind of what we have for now. But Andrew, I did say to you before we came on that I had a potential little challenge for you, and you accepted that this is okay. I'm bombarding you a little bit, but you have worked in presenting and pitching in sales before. So I'm almost certain you've heard this before, but just because I have you here, I'm curious. Do you happen to have a pen on your desk?
I do.
I do. Okay. Would you mind, telling me the story of that pen and selling me that pen? How would you sell me that pen?
I would sell you this particular pen, and it's called a Uniball pen, Uniball eye pen. And one of the things I do every morning is I write 3 pages of what is called morning pages. And to do that, you need a very good pen. It's not an expensive pen, but what you need is a pen that flows easily, but doesn't flow too quickly. Because if you use a ballpoint and things like you're trying to scribble. If you use a pencil, obviously it fades over a period of time, and then all the amazing stuff you wrote down in the morning that's going to be an article in 6 months' time fades by the time you come to look at it. So the reason I would recommend this pen is it's sort of in some ways almost like a fountain pen. It forces you to write slowly and more carefully, and flows very easily. So if you want to, at the end of the day, look back at your notes and that they're legible, this is the pen to have. So it's a Uniball eye pen.
Andrew, I knew you were going to knock that out of the park, but it was even better than I expected. Thank you so much for that. That was great. Now, for anybody who's listening, you now know how to sell the pen. If you ever get that interview question, you're more than ready. Andrew, I appreciate you coming on so much. If I could go on, I would ask you questions for another 3 hours. But today, this is what we have. If anybody wants to follow up with you, they know how to do so. And obviously, you're all over LinkedIn, so I'm sure they can connect in with you that way. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on today.
Okay, and the other thing I would say to people is that I'm always only too happy to give some advice. You know, you don't have to think that it's going to cost them money. If someone rings me and I can give some advice, I'm only too happy to give the advice.
Amazing. Everybody's going to be so happy to hear that. And somebody in the chat already said they want to order that pen. So with that, I think we're going to leave it for today. Thank you so much, Andrew, for coming on. Thank you, everybody, for jumping in and your amazing questions. And we'll look forward to everybody on the next episode of Tangent TV. Thanks again, Andrew.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you very much.